Very well. So, if there's another. No, but it's not. I don't think it's a question. It's a discussion. Discussion on the previous presentation. Okay. So, if there are no further questions, then I suggest to continue with the last presentation in this session, which is of Aurora Iannello. And now from Iberian Peninsula, we are moving to Apennines.
Just one moment. I'm going to share my desktop. Okay. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
And can you see my face too? Okay, because sometimes it's okay.
Yeah.
Well, in the next 15 minutes, I want to present a part of my PhD thesis, which was generally on Italian rent control. And in this part, I focus on first generation rent control in Italy, which was in force from World War I, exactly 1915, to 1978. And it's probably unnecessary here, but I always start by saying what first generation rent control is. Just a couple of words. It is the oldest and the strictest form of rent control, basically consisting in nominal rent freezes, which affect the housing units rented before the entry into force of the law containing the freeze. And these freezes might or might not be associated with a strong tenancy protection from eviction. In the case of Italian rent control, as you will see, they usually were. And it was extremely common in Europe after World War I. And usually first generation rent control started being replaced with softer rent control systems, the so-called second generation systems, since the end of the 1960s. These second generation systems share the common feature of allowing for periodical automatic rent increases, usually linked to the inflation rate. And here you can see this timeline, which explains the situation of rent control in Italy during the 20th century. As I said, first generation rent control was introduced in 1915. Earlier, the market was basically completely liberalized. It was completely free under the civil code. And then the market kept being controlled through rent freezes until 1978, with only a brief parenthesis of temporary return to the free market during the fascist period, only for 4 years. Then in 1978, first generation rent control was replaced by a fair rent system, which lasted 20 years. And then only in 1998, the market was mostly liberalized. When I started my PhD dissertation, which was supposed to be in economic history, I was interested in first generation rent control because of the effects that it's supposed to have on the rental market, but more specifically on the whole economy. I was very interested in studying the effects of rent control on labor mobility and on the employment rate. However, I soon had to realize that we knew too little on Italian first generation rent control to actually study its effects on the economy. We only had some contributions, usually old contributions, describing Italian rental laws and making some qualitative assessments of the expected economic effects. But most importantly, we had very scarce and uncontinuous data on controlled and uncontrolled rents in Italian cities. So I had to abandon the first objective of my thesis, and I chose to focus on 3 other objectives. First, of course, the reconstruction of what happened in Italy, of the rent control legislation in detail, and then the attempt to gather data on controlled and uncontrolled rents in Italian cities. And I managed to do that for some periods, basically for the decade from 1927 to 1938, which were actually already data which were published by the fascist government, and I had just to collect them from published sources. Instead, for the period after World War II, from 1952 to 1975, I retrieved data from the historical archive of the National Institute of Statistics, so this unpublished data. And then my third goal was to try to make sense of this policy, which was extremely criticized in Italy by economists, by journalists, by politicians, but which was still in force for more than 60 years. So the rest of the presentation is divided according to the three objectives that I mentioned, and I will tell you just a few things on each objective, on what I did. The first thing was, of course, to study these provisions, law provisions, the rental laws, which introduced new rent freezes, which are the laws that you can see in bold lettering, and the ones that extended or modified rent freezes, which are the ones in normal lettering. And of course, these were complex laws. Every law provided for different exceptions, for different. They were very detailed, and details could change very much. But here, it suffices to say that we can identify two main legal instruments: simple rent freezes, which froze the rents of housing units without tenant protection from eviction. So the tenant could be evicted, but once the tenant was evicted, the rent stayed controlled, remained controlled. But the most common legal tool in Italy was the so-called legal extension of ongoing contracts, which does not only froze rents, but it froze the tenancy contract. So the ongoing contract did not expire anymore. It was extended indefinitely. The tenant could not be evicted. Just in a few cases, he could be evicted. Very extreme cases. But if the tenant decided to break the contract, if he decided to move, or if he died, the unit returned to the uncontrolled market. And here you can see this timeline. You see that the legal extension tool in blue was much more common in Italy, but for a certain period, the two tools were used together. And the last legal extension was issued right after the end of World War II, and it protected units whose rental contract had been concluded before March 1947. And this law lasted until 1978. So until 1978, rental contracts concluded before March 1947 were rent controlled. And after 1963, a series of rent freezes was issued, and the two systems coincided. Now a couple of words on the data that I gathered. As I said, for this decade, I used a published source, this review of the National Fascist Homeowners Association, and I gathered data for 20 cities, and I just tried to analyze in a very simple way the level and evolution of rents in Italian cities divided by city size class before the liberalization of the market in 1930, during the liberalization period, and after the reintroduction of rent control. And here you can see some very, very simple graphs. Again, divided by size class, city size class. And you can see in red controlled rents, and in green uncontrolled rents, real and constant. And certain things are unsurprising, like the wide difference between controlled and uncontrolled rents in big cities, while in small cities this difference is much smaller. But there are still some surprises, like the huge gap in cities of the third class that can still be investigated. For the period after World War II, instead, there were no published statistics on controlled and uncontrolled rents. Only a weighted average of the two was reported on Italian published statistics, but there were no information on how this average was obtained. There were no information on the weight and so on. So I went to the historical archive to find for the raw data. And on the basis of these raw data, I constructed a controlled and uncontrolled series for these for the same 20 cities. And I did the very same thing, analyzing rents before the introduction, controlled and uncontrolled rents before the introduction of a specifically strict rent freeze in 1963 and after. And this is the graph that I made on this. And now I have a few more minutes to talk about the rationale of Italian rent control. As I said, this policy was very much criticized, even by the politicians or economists who supported it. They could claim that it was necessary, but they still claimed that it was a necessary evil, that it would hurt the housing market, but that there was a housing emergency and it was still necessary to protect tenants. So every rent freeze was presented as an exceptional rent freeze, something that would last just a few more years. The return to the free market was always presented as something very, very close. The historical literature on Italy usually tries to explain the adoption of rent control, and then it's the intensifying or lightening of rent control in Italy, in the history of Italy, as the result of the contrast between two opposing groups of interest, the group of tenants and the group of landlords. For example, the fascist attitude towards rent control, which was ambiguous, was explained with the fact that fascism first sought the support of landlords and then liberalized the market in 1930, but then it needed more the support of tenants and reintroduced rent control in 1934. And a similar thing has been said about the attitude of the Democrazia Cristiana, which was the party at the government after World War II. And this party always announced a forthcoming liberalization in order to satisfy landlords, but it actually never took a decision that would alienate the consent of tenants. And this is so the main thesis in the historical literature. However, studying parliamentary debates, personal correspondence, mostly from politicians, and some unpublished government reports, I noticed that the constant is the concern for inflation. Anytime there was a scent of inflation, the fear of the inflationary spiral prevailed, and rent control was invoked mainly to prevent prices from rising even more, which would increase wages and so on. So, and I noticed that rent control policy seems to follow the inflation rate rather than consensus issues. Here we have the Italian inflation rate. And of course, we know that during World War I, there were rent control laws and there was high inflation. This is not a surprise, but it becomes more interesting after. After 1920, rent control was still kept by fascism, but it became less strict. And the only liberalization period coincides with an exceptional period of deflation due to Mussolini anti-deflationary, not anti-inflationary and deflationary policy, quota 90. And as soon as inflation rose because of the war in Ethiopia, two new rent freezes were issued. Then there was the war again, and the last legal extension in ongoing contract in 1947. And then nothing more until 1963, when there was a surge in inflation. And then in December 1969, another surge in inflation and another rent freeze. The red lines are rent freezes. And then in 1974, another one. And then the second generation, the fair rent system. Another emblematic example of this thesis is the legal extension that I mentioned before, the 1947 legal extension of contracts, the last one in the Italian history, which was kept until 1978. As I said, this law protected the rent, controlled the rent of units whose contract was concluded before March 1947. And of course, the number of these units always decreased. The share of these units always decreased. In 1970, it was irrelevant. This rent control was criticized, but it was still kept for 8 years more. So why this rent control, which had become only symbolic, was kept? And I was surprised to discover that the cause could be the scala mobile mechanism. The scala mobile in Italy was a mechanism that linked wages to a special inflation index called the trade union index. The trade union index was supposed to represent the average expenses of an average working family, but housing expenses were computed only taking into account 1947 controlled rents, which were completely unrealistic in the 70s, and they were absolutely not representative of average rents. But this was an important tool to control for the increases in this index and then the increases on wages. So my conclusion is that, of course, there are many interest groups interested in rent control, not only landlords and tenants, employers were, in the case of Italy, very interested in this policy and in favor of this policy, and that rent control in Italian history can be interpreted mainly as an anti-inflationary measure. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Aurora. It was an impressive work. Sophia has a question, I think.
Yes, I have actually two questions. So one question about the graphs you showed us when we were comparing regulated versus non-regulated ones. I was actually wondering which type of rent are you comparing here? Are these really the paid rents or new rental contracts, rent prices? And also, do you control for different types of properties? Just a bit the technical questions, because as it's houses or apartments, you cannot really compare one rent to another rent without controlling for these differences. So I was actually wondering whether you have the micro data on that level so that you can really compare in that level.
can I answer this question first, or do you want to first
just
ask?
answer right away, maybe, and then
okay, just not to forget.
Yeah.
Yes, I have the very interesting thing is that for the period after 1947, the one that I built using archival data, I have microdata. So I have a few information on the units that were rented. Of course, the quantity and quality of this information is not comparable to that of contemporary surveys, but I have some information. These were usually working class and middle class units. There are not luxury apartments. There are not high income houses. So we're talking about working class and middle class units. I would like to try and create a complete data set with the micro data. For now, I just collected the averages, just to have an idea of the averages. And
so do you then calculate the average of the entire rent price, or do you adjust for these differences? Because if you don't adjust, then the comparisons are just not very...
No, these are just the averages. The sampling was made by the National Statistical Institute in Italy, and they also published the averages, but they just published a single average for controlled and uncontrolled. So basically, I'm replicating their method, just separating controlled from uncontrolled. But it's not an average that has been built with analysis on the different kinds of apartments, which was what official statisticians did.
Okay, but it's then the price per square meter, so what you're comparing, not the full price.
Price per room. Yeah.
Per room. Okay.
These are rents per room. Yeah. No, I don't have the square meters. Like I have other informations, but they didn't gather information on the number of square meters. Mm-hmm. So I had to use rents per room. These are monthly rents per room.
Okay, and because I've been working a bit on Italian house price data, and I mean, at least for sales prices, you have actually quite a lot of historic data even at the central bank. There are a couple of indices, really like full-fledged hedonic indices dating back to the 1920s or something like that.
There is I think you're referring to the Baffigi and Piselli rent series, which was published in 2019 from the Bank of Italy.
Yeah, I don't recall.
But they do not. They use the same sources. If this is the one that you're referring to, but they do not distinguish between controlled and uncontrolled. In their rental series, they do not take into account rent control.
Okay, I just thought if you don't know this one, yeah.
I'm not sure if it is the same, but it could be because Baffigi works for the Historical Institute of the Bank of Italy.
Okay, yeah, I don't know. I just now have two historic Italian indices, but I can send you the references later.
Thanks.
For Italy, sure.
Very well. We have two other questions to other people who would like to ask questions. Alexander or Sebastian, who would start? Alexander, okay.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Well, this is amazing research and the study, and this huge span of the time span that you're covering, and all these intertwined issues that you're taking into account. So I am really amazed, and I'd like to ask you, to a certain extent, this actually interests me in terms of the comparison with this semi-periphery that I'm dealing with, and I'm interested in this formative period during the First World War and immediately after the First World War, whether this whole package of the rent control system had ever been actually accompanied with a higher level of the state intervention in terms of what was mentioned here in Spain, and I'm amazed that in legal terms it is still possible. This requisitioning, or as it was mentioned, like an expropriation of but it is not expropriation because the status of the property has not been changed. So titularly, you're still entitled as an owner of the property, but for instance, in Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Poland, in this period that I'm dealing with, the state could simply occupy what they consider the surplus housing units, and they could sublet it to the persons either in a need or some state officials. And then, of course, the rent control system would be applied in the way. So I'm just curious whether something similar existed in Italy, because in what earlier was considered Eastern Europe, we had this experience twice: the first during and after the First World War, and then something very similar during and after the Second World War. So I'm curious whether something similar you find in Italy.
The answer is yes. I know that there were these exceptional powers attributed to praetori in Italian cities during fascism, and they could decide that if there was a housing emergency and there were families who had too much room for their own, a part of the house could be used to become the house of other tenants. However, I don't know this issue in detail, but I know that even if this power existed, it was not very much used. I read this. My knowledge of this comes from newspapers from the 1920s, and what was said is that basically this opportunity, this thing was not enforced actually. But the possibility existed. It was introduced by fascism.
Thank you. Sebastian, please.
Yeah, thank you. Very impressive data collection. Let me just mention that in a project with Moritz Schullerich, we have also been collecting house price data for, I think, 7 of your cities since 1950 to the current day. So that could make a nice combination, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
But I have 2 questions. And the house price data, by the way, are newspaper ads plus the Consulente data that you can buy. So 2 questions. The one is, what is the social struggle behind these policies? So, I mean, who are the landlords who are sort of losing out? Is this like the petty bourgeoisie, urban based? And I mean, who are the tenants? And I assume that there's also like a fight between communist, perhaps, right, tenant associations, which have to be accommodated into the system versus, I don't know, old bourgeoisie, which is losing out. So that would be interesting. And the second question would be, do you see this as a push also for the simultaneous rise of condominium ownership that sort of became then the housing policy option number 1?
Okay. Well, landlords in Italy are usually small landlords. Yeah, petty bourgeoisie, I would say. Urban landlords with, we don't have like big real estate firms which rent apartments. These are usually petty bourgeoisie. This is usually petty bourgeoisie. And tenants were mostly working class. Of course, here I'm talking about a large time span. So there is a difference in the organization of landlords and tenants in the 1920s or after World War II. in the 1920s, this was really interesting, like to read. There were a lot of leagues of tenants, which then unified in a Unite League. And of course, the cultural reference was communism. This, I mean, in 1919, 1920, before the actual rise of fascism. So that, yes, these leagues were perceived as the enemies in a class struggle by the League of Landlords, which simultaneously was created. Condominiums started existing in Italy during fascism, I think in the 1930s, but I'm not sure. Sorry. Yeah, and I'm not sure. Could you repeat the question on condominiums?
Yeah, my question was sort of whether the rent control was sort of at the origin of pushing condominium ownership, or whether, yeah, that was just perhaps an unintended side consequence, that condominium ownership became then the housing option number one.
I wouldn't know that, actually. This is a very interesting point, but I didn't ask this myself earlier. Thanks. That's an interesting point. And in terms of the composition, the social composition of landlords and tenants, it varied very much, but of course, there was this tendency to link tenants to the working class after World War II, but this was not always the case. Of course, this was a battle which was taken by the Communist Party, like trying to identify tenants with the working class. But actually, the statistics, the censuses. Do not hold the view, at least, that tenants in rent-controlled units were workers. As I said, rent-controlled units were usually units which had been rented even years ago. For example, in 1960, the units which were rent-controlled were units rented before 1947. So as the years passed, it was like more and more likely that tenants were retired, and they did not. They were not active workers. Sorry if I don't have a concise answer for for this.
Thanks a lot. Just one thing: we're approaching the end of the first session, but it doesn't mean that if. So, I mean, it means that if you want to leave for a break, you are free to do it. But if you would like to listen to the last question and answer of Aurora, then you can stay here, and then we can meet, or we will meet, and we shall meet at in 15 minutes from now. Please, Leonid.
Yes, sorry for for the delay. Question, maybe it's for you to consider how to develop this research. It's about regional differences, because Italy is so different, and my question was about regulation and policies. Were they totally centralized, or there were regional differences in rent control policies? And about prices, because it's local markets, and demand and supply may be different in different regions. So this behavior of prices maybe in some regions was quite different, and things like this.
Thanks. Yes. Yes. For now, I just considered the cities that are the main cities in each region. We have 20 regions, so I considered the 20 main cities in each region. But this is something that I should consider, like this regional approach. Thanks.
Okay, so thanks a lot to all presenters and to listeners. Now we will have a break. So we'll meet, as I said, now in 14 minutes. And for the moment, I will stop the recording and resume it with the beginning of the next.